Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. Yesterday was a big day for Star Wars EU fans, specifically fans of Star Wars canon, because the first bits of the High Republic are now available for consumption, and today we'll be digging into some lore from the first book in the series, Light of the Jedi. With that being said, there will be some minor spoilers, but nothing that I really wouldn't have wanted to run into before reading the book. But if you want to go in completely fresh, maybe come back later. Also, I think now would be a good time to give my impression of the book so far, Light of the Jedi. I'm only about maybe 10 chapters in, but I'm actually really enjoying it. The writing's by Charles Soule, who does the Vader comics. I think he's got a pretty good grasp on writing within the universe. There are a few bits that I think are a bit heavy-handed, but I'm looking forward to continuing the book, and you guys know me, I'm not overly lovey-dovey with Star Wars canon stuff, and if I didn't like it, I would be honest with you. And I will say I've seen a lot of negativity towards the High Republic, and it feels like a lot is coming from people who haven't yet given it a chance yet, which is most of us. So all I'll say is this: before you prejudge the book, give it a read through. I might end up loving it, I might end up not liking it. I'll be discussing it on TapCaf Transmissions next week, but on this channel I'll be doing my best to cover the lore in a way that's interesting to you guys. With that being said, let's jump into the topic, and today we'll be discussing the Vector Starfighter, which was a starfighter used exclusively by the Jedi Order during the High Republic. The High Republic is, for all intents and purposes, a golden age for the Republic. There's very little war, if any, really only small pirate or criminal factions. The Republic is generally unified under a well-loved Chancellor So, and the Republic does not have much in the way of a standing military. But the Jedi Order is also at its zenith, and seems to be in a particularly extravagant mood based on what I've read about their fighters and their spaceships. We see this in 232 BBY, 232 years before the Battle of Yavin. In that year, there's what's called as the Great Disaster. Without getting into too many spoilers, a system in the Outer Rim is threatened with imminent and total destruction, and the Jedi Order is the only force available to respond. We get a look at the Third Horizon, which is described as basically a floating cathedral made to be beautiful just because it can be, which itself carries the Vector Starfighter, the topic of discussion for today's video. Now, there are starfighters in history which probably should have been operated by a Jedi. The Actis Interceptor, for example, could not reach anywhere near its full potential if flown by an ordinary being. In Star Wars Legends, we have the Jedi Stealth X, which used the Force to fire some of its projectiles, and just generally any vessel which is extraordinarily fast and capable, but with little shielding, is often seen as the perfect fighter for a Jedi, because it will allow them to get most out of their skills without being unnecessarily burdened down by technology. The Vector, however, takes this to the absolute extreme, and I mean, you can see that just based on what the starfighter looks like. The Vector is, according to the book, as minimally designed as any starship could be. There was little shielding, almost no weaponry, very little computer systems, and the ship's capabilities were defined by their pilots. It says, and I quote, "The Jedi were the shielding, the weaponry, the minds that calculated what the vessel could achieve and where it could go." And I know what you're thinking, well, a Vector doesn't sound that bad, basically just like a really light TIE fighter or an interceptor maybe, but it truly does go beyond that. Vectors are designed so that the Jedi flying the fighter can feel the Force around them and get actual tactile sensations based on what they're doing. For example, when flying through the atmosphere of a planet, where some ships would control for the atmospheric re-entry, the Vector was, and I quote, "designed to transmit every last vibration and shimmy to the Jedi inside, so they could let the Force guide them to the best response." The Vector would have lacked traditional computer systems as mentioned, relying instead on Jedi navigational abilities, and probably the same with communication. Jedi, especially in that era, often communicated solely through the Force. That's how they coordinated attacks, and that's how we see them coordinating in this book. So it's just not designed for a regular being, and the book also compares the Vector to another famous Jedi tool, and I quote, "The Vectors required almost as much skill to handle as a lightsaber." But it's more than just their capability, it also seems like because of the tricky configuration of the cockpit, that Vectors require total and constant control. So oftentimes Jedi would have probably had to use the Force to utilize certain aspects of the craft, and we do actually see that in the book itself. On that note, speaking of lightsabers, one interesting feature of the Vector is that its main weapon could only be used if a lightsaber was placed as a sort of key within the computer system of the spacecraft. craft. This had a dual purpose. First of all, obviously, it was meant to prevent non-Jedi from firing the ship's weapons, but it was also meant so that Jedi would have to think before they fired the ship's guns, and the Vector came with multiple different damage settings. You could attempt to just warn an enemy, incapacitate an enemy, or kill an enemy. Of course, Jedi, especially of this era, were against the latter, if at all possible. So that's the Vector, something that you would almost certainly kill yourself in unless you're gifted with the Force, and more specifically, a Jedi trained to fly the vessel. Vectors, on that note, would often be used in a two-seat configuration so that a Jedi could travel with his or her Padawan, and the Padawan in the rear seat could actually take control, which I think is a nice touch. But there's probably more about the Vector in the book, so if there's something else that needs a video, I'll be happy to talk about it. Another really cool ship that we're introduced to in the High Republic is the Republic longbeam. Now, the longbeam is actually based on a bomber design from The Last Jedi, but it's certainly not a bomber. It's more like a multi-purpose, very heavy starfighter. I don't really know the exact term for it because it is such a weird ship. The longbeam could be operated with a crew as small as 3, but could also hold over 20 people. It was very, very spacious, and it performed a variety of roles. Whereas the Vector was armed with simple laser cannons, the longbeam was also armed with missile launchers, and I can see the ship being quite effective in a fight, especially with its cool turreted lasers. But especially in the Republic era, it was probably used more frequently for scouting, search and rescue, maybe even science expeditions, because it is a large ship with a lot of space for whatever's needed. We see some cool scenes of Vectors and longbeams working together during the Cataclysm at the beginning of the book, and there's an interesting distinction. Whereas the Vector seems to be a Jedi Order ship, as in a ship made by or made for, maintained by, and used by solely the Jedi Order, the longbeam was a Republic ship. The Third Horizon, which was the Jedi, I guess, light cruiser I mentioned earlier, actually carried both longbeams and Vectors because it was engaged before the Calamity in a joint expedition. So I'm interested to see how that relationship between the two factions play out as the story, whether in this book and through the 3 phases we know of for the High Republic, plays out. But that's all the lore I have for you today. Probably more High Republic videos coming out as I work my way through the book, but I want to know, without spoiling anything, if you're reading the High Republic, book 1, or one of the other books that have come out. I think there's right now a young adult book as well, maybe a comic. Let me know what you think. Are you impressed? Are you underwhelmed? All that and more, please, down in the comments. Anyway, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.